Hello, welcome again in our series on evolution. In this lesson, we are going to take a quick look at some examples that support common ancestry and evolution. And so when you're done, you should be able to give some of those examples. This is still, I would still consider this to be an introductory lesson, so this is not going to be all inclusive. If you're wondering, why didn't we mention this or that? Yes, please, let's have those discussions. But this is not supposed to cover everything that there is to know or every bit of evidence there is for evolution. All right, so kind of three main areas that I'll focus on here. One is going to be the similarities in DNA sequences, the anatomical structures in organisms, and also going to talk a little bit about the embryological development and kind of how those three areas support evidence for evolution. All right, first up, looking at the similarities in DNA sequences. Using modern technology, scientists can now directly compare the genes of one living species to another. The more genes, then, that different species share in common, the more closely related those species are presumed to be. So consider humans and chimpanzees. They share about 98% of their genes, so 98% the same. And obviously that approximate 2% is pretty different. There are, significant differences between a human and a chimpanzee, but they certainly have a lot more in common than what is different. So kind of looking at these three kind of artist versions here of these genes, we've got a mouse, a chimpanzee, and a human. And if we take a look at those, this one, looking at that one's going to be the mouse one, and then these two are going to be the chimpanzee and the human. And this one here is going to be the human. All right, another area showing support for evolution is looking at anatomical structures. There are structures that are called homologous and analogous. And we'll take a look at analogous here in just a moment. First, let's take a look at homologous. Similarities shared by closely related species, that is, species who share many characteristics, are homologous because the species have descended from a common ancestor which had that trait. Homologous structures may or may not serve the same function. So we're just talking about having the same, for example, the same bones, but not necessarily the same function. So looking at the forelimbs of mammals, are considered homologous because all mammals show the same basic pattern. A single proximal bone joins a pair of more distal bones which connect to bones of the wrist, hand, and digits. So we're going to see, let me use a different color here. So these would be the proximal bones where those appendages or forelimbs would be attached, and then working our way down to those distal bones, we can see these phalanges and, i.e. fingertips in humans. And then we're going to find these similar bone structures, and I like this diagram because it actually has them highlighted in color for us. So here, 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 and here. And again, you kind of see the off-white and the yellow bones, kind of where we'd find those in both in humans, dogs, birds, and whales. And again, those are going to serve different functions in those mammals, but they are in fact the same bones, the same structures. So those would be homologous structures. We also have what are called analogous structures. These are going to have similarities shared by distantly related species that may have evolved separately because they live in similar habitats or they serve a similar function. So these structures are analogous because they serve similar functions, but they've evolved independently. So comparing the wings of bats birds, pterosaurs, or in this case, butterflies. We have butterflies, birds, bats. These all have structures that are gonna serve the function of flying, but they are not necessarily closely related to one another. Okay. Sometimes we will see where there are similar bone structures underlying some of that. So, for example, we've got this bird here and this bat here. We're going to see some of those same bones across these animal groups, but they're in different. They're laid out, organized differently, and that's because that those abilities to fly, that function to fly, actually evolved in separate kind of pathways, as it were, separate ancestors. Embryological development. Embryology is a branch of comparative anatomy, which is studying the development of vertebrate animals before birth or hatching. Like adults, embryos show similarities which can support common ancestry. For example, all vertebrate embryos have gill slits and tails. Keep in mind, gill slits, I'm using bunny quotes here, are not actually gills, however. The better name for those would be pharyngeal. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Pharyngeal slits. They connect to the throat, to the outside early in the development, but eventually close in many species. Only in fish and the larval amphibians do they contribute to the development of gills. In mammals, that tissue between the first gill slit forms part of the lower jaw and the bones of the inner ear. So that's what happens to those later in development with the mammals. Embryonic tail does not develop into a tail in all species. It does in some, like I think about some mammals, but of course in humans it doesn't. It actually becomes reduced during development to our tailbone. Okay. I will just want to comment here. It's tempting to put up some of the embryonic development photos showing kind of early embryology. A lot of those have been shown to exaggerate the similarities, and I don't want to mislead students by showing those kind of embryonic developmental stages. I think that those diagrams, the point of those diagrams still holds true, but considering some of the debate about the exaggeration that's involved in that, I don't want to perpetuate that misunderstanding or the I don't want to be seen as kind of stacking the deck here when talking about embryonic or embryological development. All right, so now you should be able to give some examples that support common ancestry and evolution, talking about the embryonic or embryological development, looking at anatomical structures, and looking at DNA sequences. As always, if you have questions, please see me or take a look at some of our other resources.